Hello and welcome to Eurostat's webinar series. I'm Dean Vuletic, an Information and Communication Officer in Eurostat, and I'm your moderator for today's webinar. Today, we're talking about the new Sustainable Development Goals EU Monitoring Report. The 2026 edition has just been published on the 3rd of June, so this is a chance to be among the first to learn about the European Union's progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. You'll also learn what the EU is doing to strengthen water resilience and water quality. At the heart of the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the 17 SDGs provide a comprehensive policy framework worldwide towards ending poverty, reducing inequalities, protecting the environment, and tackling climate change, while ensuring that no one is left behind. You'll be able to directly ask our experts questions after their presentations. Please send the questions to us via slido.com. The Slido code is hashtag 1778867. Now to our experts. We'll be hearing from Christine Meyer. She is the Deputy Head of Unit for Environmental Statistics and Accounts and Sustainable Development in Eurostat. Christine will present the key findings of the 2026 EU monitoring report on progress towards the SDGs. And then we'll be joined by Isaac Ojea Jimenez, a policy officer for sustainable freshwater management in the European Commission's Directorate General for Environment. The title of Isaac's talk is Europe's Water Under Pressure, EU Policy Responses on Water Resilience and Quality. We'll wrap up with a Q&A session with Isaac and Friederike Oehler, Eurostat's team leader for Sustainable Development Indicators. But first, it's over to Christine.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to discuss the results of our last monitoring exercise with you.
So, Christine, what exactly is it that you're monitoring?
Well, thank you, Dean, for this question. Let's go to the basics first. We are monitoring how the EU is doing in achieving the 17 UN goals of sustainable development. The SDGs include economic, social, environmental, and institutional objectives that have been adopted globally in 2015. We monitor the EU's progress along a set of 102 indicators that are based on the objectives and the ambitions of the UN goals, but focus on what's relevant for the EU. Therefore, we have, for example, 27 indicators that measure progress towards clearly defined EU policy targets.
How do you assess progress? It sounds like a complex task.
Well, actually, the basic steps are very simple. We calculate the compound annual growth rate over the last 5-year period for each indicator. Then we compare the observed growth rate, here in orange, with the growth rate that would be required to reach the target, here in yellow. We use a set of fixed thresholds to qualify the progress of each indicator. I will come to this later. As last step, we use a scoring function to average the progress of all indicators of a goal. In this way, we are able to assess each indicator individually, such as here for SDG 13, climate action. The target symbol shows which indicators are assessed against the quantitative EU target. For the other indicators, we assess whether they are going into the desired direction and at which pace. This results into the green upward-looking or red downward-looking arrows. As mentioned before, we have 4 categories: on track, moderate progress, insufficient progress, or movement away from the EU target. Then the final step is to take the average of the assessment results of all individual indicators of a goal to assess progress at goal level. For example, here you see that the EU has made some progress towards SDG 13. Our methodology is rather simple, which makes it easy to understand and accessible also to non-experts. We publish all the data and the methodology on the Eurostat website, which means that our approach is very transparent. We also do the same assessment for each EU country, which is then integrated into the European semester country reports. Since we use the same indicators and the same methodology for all countries, the results are easily comparable.
When it comes to the results, what are the 2026 key findings?
Well, here you can see, Dean, that the EU has made progress towards most SDGs at varying paces and despite remaining challenges. Significant progress has been made towards five SDGs: decent work and economic growth, responsible consumption and production, reduced inequalities, gender equality, and quality education. Then there is a big group of SDGs with moderate progress by the EU. No overall progress was observed for Partnership for the Goals, and the EU has moved away from the Sustainable Development Objectives of life on land and clean water and sanitation. Therefore, I'm very pleased to have Isaac with us, who will tell us more about this topic.
So, Christine, could you present some of the key developments per SDG? Why don't we start, for example, with the best performing goal?
Yes, of course. According to our latest assessment, the best performing goal was SDG 8. For example, GDP per capita has increased, the EU's employment rate has reached a new record high in 2025, and the EU is therefore on track to meet its target of 78% by 2030. In the area of decent work, the indicators improved as well. The EU has also made significant progress in almost all the indicators used for monitoring SDG 12. For example, the consumption of hazardous chemicals has decreased considerably, and the green economy has continued to outperform other economic sectors in its growth. The EU has continued to make significant progress towards SDG 10. Income inequalities within countries have decreased. Member states are also converging in terms of household income, while disparities in GDP per capita have widened slightly. The gap between non-EU citizens and EU home country nationals has narrowed for almost all the indicators monitored, which suggests that the integration of migrants is improving. There are two more SDGs where the EU has made significant progress. As regards gender equality, women's hourly earnings are catching up with those of men, and the gender employment gap has also decreased, but much stronger progress will be necessary. In the context of SDG 4, the EU is well on track to meet its 2030 targets for participation in early childhood education and tertiary educational attainment. On the other hand, trends have been unfavorable for educational outcomes. The proportion of low achieving pupils in the OECD's PISA study increased strongly.
When it comes to the EU making moderate progress, which areas can you highlight, Christine?
Well, we have many SDGs where the EU has made moderate progress. I would like to highlight just some interesting developments. In the context of SDG 9, the use of public passenger transport modes has increased back to pre-pandemic levels. The share of renewable energy, an indicator for SDG 7, has increased, but stronger growth is needed to meet the 2030 target. Regarding SDG 1, for example, severe material and social deprivation improved slightly. As far as SDG 13 is concerned, the EU's greenhouse gas emissions have further decreased in 2024, but stronger progress is still needed to meet the 55% reduction target by 2030.
And which areas have been more challenging for the EU?
Well, unfortunately, there's some areas where we need more action. So, for example, SDG 17 shows no overall progress due to both favorable and unfavorable developments. For example, the EU financing to developing countries has fallen in recent years. On the other hand, EU trade with the world's least developed countries has grown. And the EU continues to move away from the objectives of SDG 15. This is mainly due to continued land degradation and a decline in biodiversity. On the other hand, the forest area increased, which is important for biodiversity. Finally, the EU is moving away from the objectives of SDG 6. Connection to wastewater treatment improved, but the picture is mixed for water quality and unfavorable when it comes to water scarcity. Pressure on the EU's freshwater resources is growing, which is exacerbated by an increase in the EU area impacted by drought.
There are many other topics which you analyze in the report. Could you describe some of them? For example, I'm very interested in the topic of leave no one behind.
Well, indeed, leave no one behind is one of the core principles of the 2030 Agenda. Comparisons among EU countries sometimes mask differences at a smaller regional scale. Therefore, we present a selection of indicators with regional breakdown in a special chapter of our annual SDG monitoring report. In this example, which you can see here, the gender employment gap, you can see major differences between the north of Italy and the south, or between the eastern part of Germany and the western part. In general, the regions colored in blue have already reached the EU target. The regions colored in brown still need to catch up. Then we have another chapter, EU in the World, which looks at a selection of indicators from the economic, environmental, and social dimension, comparing the EU to other major regions of the world. Patent applications are a measure for innovation. They are key for competitiveness and productivity of an economy. You can see here that the number of patent applications per million inhabitants in the EU are comparable to the United States. However, other major world economies, such as Japan and China, have many more patent applications. South Korea recorded by far the highest number of patent applications in 2024. In a globalized world, countries' action towards sustainable development may positively or negatively influence other countries and their capacity to achieve the SDGs. Such impacts are called spillover effects. Here you can see the EU greenhouse gas emission footprint, which sums up all greenhouse gas emissions related to goods and services consumed in the EU. The blue part of the bars show greenhouse gas emissions that were emitted in countries outside the EU and consumed in the EU. The total greenhouse gas footprint of the EU decreased between 2018 and 23 by 12%.
Is there an alternative way of assessing the EU's progress towards sustainability?
Yes, Dean, you know that in the past we have always followed the structure of the 2030 Agenda with indicators grouped under the 17 development goals. However, such a structure can hide cross-cutting patterns. This year, we have therefore introduced a new chapter with an alternative cross-cutting analysis using the same SDG indicators as in the 17 thematic chapters, but classifying them according to the 4 dimensions of sustainability: social, economic, environment, and institutions. The best results have been achieved in the economic dimensions, as you can see in this graph. In contrast, reaching environmental sustainability remains challenging. No progress has been observed in institutional sustainability, signaling that governance and implementation capacity have to speed up.
And finally, Christine, where can those watching us find more information?
Well, I showed a lot of results here, but you can find all the monitoring results either in the full report, which you see here in the blue cover, and which contains a lot of extra information and explanations, or in our brochure with the gray cover that displays concise results in a very visual way. I also recommend to have a look at our EU SDG progress tracker, and there are other visualization tools on our website. All our indicators are also available on the website and Eurostat's dissemination database.
Thank you, Christine, for explaining all of that.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
And now it's time for Isaac to tell us about EU policy responses on water resilience and quality, Europe's water under pressure.
Thank you, Dean. Good morning to everyone. I'm happy to be here with you sharing which is the currently status of Europe's waters and under which pressures it is, and which are the responses that the European Commission is putting on the table in terms of increase the resilience and the quality of water. First of all, I want to give you a brief overview of what is the existing water legislation. So currently, the EU has a very strong water legislation. I have put here in the middle the Water Framework Directive because it's the main focus of the talk today. But as you can see, it has many links with many pieces of legislation, to name a few. So the groundwater, drinking water, floods, the oceans water, which the water that we use that we reuse to increase water for supply for agriculture, the treatments that we do it from the urban water, and also the pressures of nitrates that we have from agriculture, and finally also the quality of water of the bathing places. So just to highlight a very important element here of the Water Framework Directive is that the main working unit and the managing unit is the river basin districts. So you can see that yeah, water borders don't understand the national borders, and then this entails that was very innovative at that time. This entails that different administrations will have to collaborate and communicate in order to arrange and manage the water. So also there is an obligation as well that for the member states that periodically they need to report to the Commission, and this a large amount of data. This data is centralized, the collection and collected from at the European Environmental Agency. You can see here I put just the link of the latest report in 2024. We are in the third reporting cycle, so that was from the data reported in 2022 by the member states. Here I have just highlighted a few elements. This is coming from the Commission is also doing its own assessment of this data. But here, as you can see that we had the conclusions. We have averages here, of course, but you can see that even that the situation is slightly improving at some points, and that there are gaps or differences across different member states. But overall, the increase of water quality and quantity is not so good. So you see that only 37% of surface waters are in good ecological status, and only around 30% of surface water is in good chemical status. Groundwater is a little bit better, but you can see overall that the pressures continue to exist. And pressures means pollution pressures, hydromorphological changes, and also, of course, very important, the over-abstraction of water. And this is also exacerbated, increased by the climate change, of course, which is increasing the hydric stress and increasing water scarcity and droughts episodes, especially in Southern Europe and metropolitan areas and regions with intensive irrigation. And also touristic destinations, so are becoming all of them very vulnerable to this water scarcity, but also more frequent flood episodes. And you can see here in the flood risk maps that there are some areas where they have a very big threat of floods. So what is the Commission doing to battle this is to, first of all, follow the legislation, and one of the main provisions is that we have to update the list of pollutants that we have in these three pieces of the legislation, the Water Framework Directive and the two daughter directives, surface and groundwater. So first of all, revise which against the latest evidence, scientific evidence, which are the pollutants which are of EU concern, and which are the thresholds, the limits to which we can assume that the risk is affordable. We have also introduced more monitoring obligations. Yeah, of course, this has been entered. Yeah, this regulation has entered into law in March 2026. Sorry that I forgot to say this. The third also element is that, and I think it was very innovative to introduce this, is to evaluate mixtures of pollutants, not only single pollutants, but which is the combined effect of the mixtures of pollutants. We also introduced elements of digital reporting, so a little bit to make it easier and more straightforward reporting, yeah, and faster reporting of the data. And finally, because of the natural disasters episodes, we wanted also to introduce more cooperation, measures and alert systems and communications, increase the communications between member states. Here also you can see, the main pollutants that we managed to somehow put it in the new legislation. So new pharmaceuticals, PFAS, of course, because it's increasing concern for the population, bisphenols, pesticides, antimicrobial resistance, and microplastics. These are innovative elements as well. So finally, I want to present the European Water Resilience Strategy, that it's a strategy that many actors have come up with, but it is also a key priority in the agenda of von der Leyen, but also the Council have put their own initiatives, and the European Parliament. The European Water Resilience Strategy pretends to be not new legislation, but instead it's a wake-up call, so what we call an assistant agenda to assist member states in helping in their management of water. So it entails, we have identified three main objectives. First of all, there is an environmental objective. So we want to restore the full natural water cycle from the oceans, water that comes into land and then flies down again into the sea. Then there is an economic objective. So we want to build a water smart economy and a strong industry that uses water in an efficient way. And finally, there is also an objective for social. So there are still 22 million citizens in Europe that don't have access to clean water. So we want to secure clean and affordable water for everyone. And for these three objectives, we have identified 5 main enabling areas. So first of all, we wanted to have better implementation and governance. And for this, we really believe that the legislation that is already existing has to be well implemented and on time. So we are going to initiate as well, or we have already initiated structured dialogues with member states in order to see which are the capacities, the gaps that they have, and how the Commission can help them to be in the right place. Then there is these investments and infrastructure. We recognize that there are investments gaps, but also we acknowledge that there is absorption capacity lacks, gaps. Then there is the element of digitalization. So we want to accelerate digitalization through remote sensing, Internet of Things, so increased use of water meters, for example, and leaking sensors. And also use artificial intelligence to treat the large amount of data flows. And also another element is about the research, innovation, and skills. So to increase the competitiveness of industry, to have more water young experts as well, and to also to bring patents from the concept into the market. And finally, the enabler of security. So we want to have a stronger security and preparedness, and this entails early warning systems against malicious attacks and natural disasters. Also, I want to highlight here the water efficiency first principle that is also one of the main flagships of the strategy. So water resilience is essential for competitiveness. We recognize this. Water is limited. It must be used and reused efficiency. So the Commission has proposed a non-binding and aspirational target, of course, acknowledging that the different situations that the different member states have. But as a principle, the measures to reduce water demand should be adopted as a priority over the exploitation of additional water resources. So in decreasing order of priority, water consumption should be first reduced, followed by measures to increase the supply. So to wrap up, just to remember that, okay, a few points, so that implementation, it's key, implementation of the existing legislation that we already have, that water quantity and quality and resilience go hand to hand, so it's together. Prevention is more effective and cheaper than remediation, and also to remember that protecting water means not only it's not only an environmental issue, but it's also a social and economic issue. And then thank you very much for the invitation, and just give you here the contact of our functional mailbox where you can write any queries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isaac, for those insights into EU policy responses on water resilience and quality. The two presentations have given us many insights into the SDGs in an EU context, and now it's time to hear from you and answer any questions that you have. Isaac is now back to answer your questions live, and he's joined by Friederike Oehler, Eurostat's team leader for Sustainable Development Indicators. So send us your questions for Friederike and Isaac via slido.com, hashtag 1778867. Let's start with our first question. Why is the EU performing so poorly on SDG 6, clean water and sanitation? Friederike, that's a question for you.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. So on SDG 6, I think it is very important to note, first of all, that our EU SDG indicator set that we use to assess EU progress towards the SDGs with, it is not equal to the UN SDG indicator set. The UN targets of SDG 6 focus very much on access to safe drinking water and sanitation. The EU is already very advanced in this area. For the largest part of the EU territory, safe drinking water and access to sanitation is fully ensured. So this is why we are actually not monitoring progress in this area any longer. Instead, our indicator set focuses mostly on water quality and also on water scarcity, which is much more relevant to the EU nowadays. And as we have seen, unfortunately, EU rivers are increasingly polluted with pesticides and phosphates. And also the issue of water scarcity is becoming worse. So those are the trends that we really need to reverse. Thanks, Dean.
And now for the second question, a question for Isaac. Why is protecting water quantity and quality becoming more challenging and complex today than in the past?
The water pollution challenges are evolving. This is the answer, not the direct answer. But in the past, the focus was often on a small number of well-known pollutants. And today, we are increasingly dealing with emerging pollutants, such as PFAS for pharmaceuticals, microplastics, and often present in mixtures of complex mixtures at very low concentrations, but they have a synergistic effect, so that the combination of all these pollutants can create an even harder, stronger combined toxic effect. So at the same time, climate change and water scarcity can reduce the dilution. So this is also increasing in rivers and increasing the concentration and increasing also the pressure on aquatic ecosystems. So this means that protecting water quality increasingly it requires a combination of the prevention, innovation, monitoring, of course, and cooperation across sectors. Yeah, this is the end of my answer.
Thank you, Isak. Now, another question for Friederike. What needs to be done to improve progress on SDG 15, life on land?
Yes, a very good question. I think we must be aware that our natural capital, including our ecosystems, biodiversity, and soils, form the basis of our current well-being, but also of the well-being of future generations. And at the same time, a degradation of ecosystems and the loss of biodiversity is not easily reversible. Our results indicate that biodiversity is on the decline. In particular, grassland butterfly populations are decreasing rapidly. And also the designation of terrestrial protected areas lags behind the targets that the EU has set for itself. At the same time, we see an extension of the areas impacted by droughts. Of course, there is a very large year-to-year variation in this indicator, but even if we look at the 10-year moving average, we observe an increase in the area that is impacted by droughts. So those are clearly the key challenges for the near future that need to be addressed. Thank you.
And why has water resilience become such an important priority for the European Union? A question for you, Isak.
Yes, true. Well, water resilience has become increasingly important because Europe is facing growing pressures on its water resources from the climate change, from the pollution, more frequent episodes of droughts, floods, and increasing water demand. The water is essential not only for ecosystems and biodiversity, but also for drinking water, for agriculture, in irrigation, energy production, industry, and economic competitiveness. Recent assessments of the river basin management plans show that despite progress in some areas, yeah, the overall status of Europe's water is not improving quickly enough. This is why the European Commission adopted the water resilience strategy in 2025. The idea is to move towards a more water smart and resilient Europe by improving water efficiency, protecting the whole water cycle, reducing pollution at source, investing in innovation, and strengthening implementation across member states. In other words, water resilience is increasingly about ensuring long-term security and sustainability for both people and the economy. This is the end of my answer.
Thank you, Isak. Frederica, again to you. Do you also publish data for EU member states?
Yes, we do. We publish data for all EU member states for almost all of our SDG indicators, except the very few that are not broken down by country, as for example, ocean acidity or fish stock biomass. We also provide comparable country progress assessments on our dedicated section and the status of individual countries as compared to the EU average. You can find all those data on our website. Further to that, the European semester spring package, which has been released on the very same date in our monitoring report, includes recommendations for each country that contain an analysis of progress towards the SDGs based on our Eurostat data. It is important to note, however, that our assessments for the countries deviate from the national SDG assessments, since our assessment is based on our EU SDG indicator set. The countries themselves usually report to the UN using the UN indicators, and some also do their own progress assessments, which are then based on national indicator sets. So there are clear differences. Also, the methodologies may differ, even though we are working closely together and regularly exchanging best practices with each other.
So, another question for Frederica. In the report, a viewer has seen statistics on railways, trains under SDG 9. Are there statistics potentially showing carbon footprints comparing railways, air traffic, and vehicles in the EU? And how have they impacted in the last 10 years on SDG 13?
Yes, the answer, unfortunately, is no. We don't have those statistics on carbon footprints. We only have the statistics on the share of buses and trains in passenger transport and of the share of rail and inland waterways in freight transport. Under SDG 12, we monitor the consumption footprint and material footprints. And then under SDG 13, the climate action, we do, of course, monitor greenhouse gas emissions in general, but we don't have any breakdowns of carbon footprints for different transport modes, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Frederica, for that question. Now, up to what date do the indicators take data into account? One of our viewers has noticed that for GHE, the chart only covered data up to 2023. Frederica, could you answer that for us, please?
Yes. So our data cutoff date for this year's monitoring was the 25th of April of 2026. So we took update statistics into account that were available at this date, the 25th of April. Any data becoming available after the date, we were not able anymore to include into our report. And of course, unfortunately, many of our indicators, we do get annual updates, but we also have indicators that are only updated every second or even third or even longer after longer years, mainly in the environmental domain. Some of our indicators, be it because they're very hard to take the measures on the ground, it's expensive data collections, also environmental issues often, they don't change so rapidly. So many of our indicators might not have yet 2024 or 2025 data available. That's right.
Thank you, Frederica. Now, Isak, a question for you. The report shows setbacks on SDG 6 and SDG 15. Which measures under the EU Water Resilience Strategy and biodiversity policies are expected to reverse these trends before 2030?
Yeah, I'm gonna unmute. Yes, thank you, Dean, for the question. Yes, indeed. Yeah, SDG 6 it refers to the clean water and sanitation, and SDG 15 it's life on land. So I have to first of all say that the Water Framework Directive already foresee that these are connected. So there are a concept, an element in the legislation saying that this. It's called groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystems, which means that there should be enough water in the aquifers and also in the rivers through the ecological flows to allow this land species to have enough water to survive. Yeah. So what is doing within the water resilience strategy? There is a set of 50 proposed actions an action tracker as well. So we'll follow this up to 2030. And some of them, I can give an examples of them, but we'll focus, for example, in recover the full cycle of the water. So from the sea that goes to the clouds rain, and then all the path, yeah, to the sea again. Yeah, this we want to recover and to restore this full cycle of water. Specific actions, for example, like I can name maybe the sponge facilities, that it's a coordination framework under this strategy intended to bring together and scale up natural water retention measures across Europe. So increase the natural water retention measures with nature-based solutions. Yeah, and this can also be mimicked, yeah, both in the countryside, so in landscapes, yeah, but also in the cities. So in the urban areas, we can put green roofs, permeable surfaces, urban wetlands, rain gardens. So this could be an example of these different actions that the strategy is foreseeing. Yeah, this is the end of my answer.
And with that, we wrap up our webinar on the 2026 Sustainable Development Goals EU Monitoring Report. Thank you to our speakers, Christine Meyer and Isaac Ojea Jimenez, and to Friederike Oehler for taking part in the Q&A session. And many thanks to you, our viewers, for joining us and sending questions. Please participate in our feedback survey via Slido. There you can also find the address to contact our multilingual user support if you have further questions. In the meantime, we wish you a great data-informed summer season, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Goodbye for now from Eurostat in Luxembourg.